Okay, hello everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending today's AIAA Los Angeles Las Vegas sections e-town hall meeting for the Crew Dragon Historic Perspectives with a group of distinguished book authors and speakers. So before we introduce the moderator and the panelist, we have some introduction for the AIAA. Okay, so basically today, right now, we are doing the introduction. I apologize that our section chair, Dr. Chandrasekhar Sawani, who works in AIAA Rocketdyne, he is a little bit busy this morning, so he cannot join us right now. Maybe he will come back later, but so he asked me to welcome everyone. So around after the welcome message, and David, Mr. Hitt, is going to lead the panel and start the event. And around 12:30, that's but it's flexible. We'll see how it goes. And just to remind everyone, this event is being recorded and it will be posted online. This is just a rough list of for each of the panelists who might say something, but everybody will say something and answer your question, and David will lead the moderator. And just a few words about our section chair. He's the chief scientist in special engineer and scientist in AIAA Rocketdyne. He holds multiple patents, and he's very crucial in developing SLS or many Mars rover projects. He is also the member fellow of Royal Aeronautical Society, Astronomical Society, and he's associate fellow of AIAA. Just to remind everyone, if you want to ask questions, please type in Q&A. Or click a raise hand. If any issue for some, it shouldn't happen. But if any issue with Zoom, disconnect. Try to please keep trying to reconnect. It should be fine. Just a few words why we want to join the society. You get great opportunity for networking and get updates for latest technology, and we also do STEM outreach. And it can help your resume with multiple events. And our headquarters is in Virginia, and it's a national organization. We are the Los Angeles Las Vegas chapter of the organization. And Mr. Marty Waltman is in our audience. He's the Las Vegas chapter chair. We have a lot of journals, Aerospace American magazines. If you join the membership, you got the ARC access for journals, a lot of very professional information. You also have career center, and you got a lot of connection. We also have the AIAA Foundation for education, and you also get noted for our upcoming events. And we have different type of membership, the educator, and the e-membership is free. They are free. For the e-membership, is first year, it's a trial membership. Yeah, we have membership chair, Aldo, and the section chair, Shekhar, Dr. Sawani, and the vice chair, Fred, and I'm the events program chair. And Marty Waltman in the audience is our Las Vegas chair. And just to mention, actually, we also have Orange County section chapter, and Dr. Jim Martin in the audience. He's our Orange County program chair. And okay, so let me we have great pleasure today to have David, Mr. Hitt, as our as you see, he has a very nice background. He's in space now, talking to us. He's the co-author of two books, Homesteading Space, the Skylab Story, written with astronaut Owen Garrett and Joe Kerwin. And let's see. And both they rise the space shuttle early years. And David works at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center as a payload engagement strategist for NASA Space Launch System, as a contractor employee with ASRC Federal. He's a recipient of Silver Snoopy Award given by NASA Astronaut Office. Wow, that's really fantastic. Yeah, a former newspaper editor. He's a native of Huntsville, Alabama, and holds a bachelor degree in journalism from University of Mississippi. He and his wife, Rebecca, have one son, Owen. So let's welcome David to start the event. It's our great pleasure. So David, it's all yours. Let me know when you want me to start play the video.
Thank you so much, Ken. I appreciate you hosting us today, and huge thanks to the AIAA Los Angeles, Las Vegas section for holding this panel. As a senior member in the Greater Huntsville section, it's a real privilege to get to rub elbows with our brethren. So really appreciate it. Tell you what, if you don't mind, why don't you go ahead and roll the video, and after that, I will introduce the rest of our panelists, and we'll leap into it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Certainly when you go through the launch day preparations, there's a lot of moments that kind of stand out to you.
When the engine's light, you know you are going, and you know you're going somewhere pretty fast. When the engine's shut off, you go from 3 Gs to 0 Gs instantaneously, and things start floating. And I remember distinctly just thinking, what just happened?
Same thing happens when you get to space station. It's kind of a defining moment when you get the hatches back open. By sharing this experience with SpaceX and creating another partner that has the same capability, I think we really set the future up to continue to blossom.
This will be the first time humans have ridden on the Falcon 9, even though it's flown many, many times. And so just taking in that experience and the sounds and all those things that we can relate to future crews is going to be something important to do too.
Ten, 9, 8, 7.
All right, thank you so much, Ken.
Welcome.
We have an incredible opportunity this week to watch history being made. I've been following this launch, been excited about this launch, and every once in a while you see something, you read something that just kind of totally changes your perspective on what you're about to see. And intellectually, I knew, this is the latest in a series of firsts, but was reading the fact that this is the 5th first U.S. crewed flight in history. We had the first flight of the Mercury spacecraft, Gemini, Apollo, the space shuttle, and now this. And wow, that's kind of amazing. The first 4 of those, the first 3 of those took place in a period of just a handful of years. The first 4 took place in a period of 20 years, and now it's been almost 40 years since the last time we've done this, and it's kind of amazing. And selfishly, it made me want to. I'm the sort. My appreciation of watching history is so much greater when I can actually, okay, let's dig into the context, the history that got us to where we are. Wouldn't it be awesome if I could pull together a group of, incredibly knowledgeable space historians who could inform me about that? And thankfully, I have the strength to pull that I can. So, with me today, I've got my dream team to be educated myself. Share that with y'all because we're nice folks. Let me start by giving you a rundown of who we've got on this call today. Geoffrey Bowman is a retired lawyer who lives with his wife Sandra in Belfast, Northern Ireland. He spent many years defending mainly shipyard asbestos claims, which usually involved calculating the size of settlements A lifelong space enthusiast, Geoffrey just about remembers the flights of Yuri Gagarin and Alan Shepard and has many fond memories of the Apollo missions. He finally got to see a Saturn launch, the Apollo-Soyuz launch in July 1975. He contributed 2 chapters to the Outward Odyssey's Footprints in the Dust volume. He's recently completed the manuscript for his first complete book, a biography of Apollo 17 astronaut Ron Evans, with the working title A Long Voyage to the Moon, which should be published next year. His research included a meeting last August with Ron's widow, Jan Evans, and their daughter, Jamie, in Scottsdale, Arizona. Thank you for being with us today, Geoffrey.
With pleasure.
Also with us today, we have Melvin Croft, who has over 40 years of experience as a professional geologist with 27 years working in industry and 12 years teaching geology at a small college in Maine. He holds BA and MS degrees in geology from the University of South Florida and Florida State. He's been an avid space fan since the beginnings of human spaceflight and is fortunate to have met many astronauts and cosmonauts. Mel, along with John Yuskauskas, is presently collaborating on another edition to the University of Nebraska Press Outward Odyssey book series, which will chronicle the story of extravehicular activity. The book that's kind of the main one he's going to be talking about today, he and John co-wrote, Come Fly With Us, about the Space Shuttle payload specialists. With me today also, Francis French brings international experience in relating science, engineering, music, astronomy, art, and wildlife to general audiences through classes, workshops, public speaking, television, and documentary productions. He is the author of numerous best-selling history books, including In the Shadow of the Moon, and an international keynote speaker at conferences.
Good morning, David. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Also with us is Richard Jurek, who is the author of Ultimate Engineer, The Remarkable Life of NASA's visionary leader, George Lowe. He is also co-author of Marketing the Moon, The Selling of the Apollo Lunar Program. A contributor to Air and Space magazine and website, he authored the January 2019 cover story, The Man Who Won the Moon Race, a profile of George Lowe as Apollo Program Manager and his role in the Apollo 8 decision. He served as a consulting producer on the award-winning PBS American Experiences miniseries, Chasing the Moon, and is also a frequent commentator and speaker on NASA history, especially concerning its historic public affairs efforts and pioneering brand journalism. He appeared internationally for media outlets such as Forbes, Slate, NBC News, CBS News, Canadian Public Radio, Australian Public Radio, US National Public Radio, NPR's Backstory with the History Guys, and other popular media outlets. A marketing and communications executive for the past quarter century, he lives and works in the greater Chicagoland area. Also joining us, Emeline Paat-Dahlstrom is an author, speaker, and space entrepreneur. She is the co-founder of International Space Consultants and SpaceBase, a social enterprise working to democratize access to space by catalyzing space ecosystems in emerging countries, starting with New Zealand. Emeline is an Edmund Hillary Fellow, currently residing in Christchurch, New Zealand. She is a former Chief Impact Officer and Space Faculty Lead of Singularity University in California. Emeline has physics and Earth and Space Science degrees and attended International Space University Space Studies program, where she helped develop and run its Master's in Summer Space Studies program, Summer Space Studies programs. She has worked and consulted for several space companies, including Space Adventures, Zero Gravity Corporation, and Odyssey Moon. She currently advises space startups, including Ceres Robotics and Extraterrestrial Power, and their plans for commercial lunar missions. She is currently an associate editor with the New Space Journal. A global citizen and adventure seeker, she has lived and worked in 10 countries and have visited over 85 countries on 7 continents. Emeline is co-author of the book, Realizing Tomorrow, The Path to Private Spaceflight, which was selected in 2013 for the U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff reading list.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Our final panelist, Chris Petty, is a space and aviation enthusiast and author of the High Frontier blog. His articles have appeared on Adam Savage's Tested site and the Space Review, and his first book, Beyond Blue Skies, the rocket plane program that led to the space age, is due for publication this November as part of the Outward Odyssey series. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning.
Thanks.
To start with, I'll throw out a question just for any or all of the panelists. I'd love to start just by hearing briefly about the first time you were excited about a launch and or a launch that particularly inspired you. So if anybody has a story they'd like to share, I'd love to hear it.
I'll speak up. I remember it as clear as yesterday. Third grade, I grew up in Florida. Tampa Tribune every day had stuff about astronauts, so I was already into this. But in third grade, Miss Falsetti, my teacher, said, we're going to go out and watch Alan Shepard launch into space. We were about 50 miles away, but for a 10-year-old to go out and hear the countdown, and about 30 seconds later, you could see this rocket rise. You could just see the red flames. And I thought, there's a human being on the top of that, Alan Shepard. Oh, I want to do that. Never forget that story. Thanks, Miss Falsetti.
Well, I can go. So yeah, I was too young to actually remember the Saturn V launches, and I've seen a couple of night launches of the shuttle at the Cape, which are really spectacular. But for me, really probably the most significant is to be in Baikonur during 2001 when the first space tourists actually went up in space. And so I don't know if you can actually see this, but I took this photo of the Soyuz when Dennis Tito went up. And just for me, it's just the realization that, you know, a small space startup company with a small team can actually open up, you know, the whole space frontier to space tourists was just fascinating. And that was just an amazing time.
Thank you.
Yeah, for me, I think it would be STS-1, the first shuttle test flight. At the time I was, let's think, nine years old and living in the UK. So there was a lot of coverage on the BBC about it. And it was the first human spaceflight I could really watch all the build up to, because, you know, there'd been the hiatus and the only other stuff we saw was kind of grainy footage of Salyut missions. So yeah, all the excitement about that and the fact that it was a space plane for me made a big difference, and it came back to land at Edwards, and yeah, that was kind of a defining thing for me.
I'll jump in with what Chris said there. I mean, STS-1 was huge in England. It was, you know, coming from a different country, and maybe those in America don't realize how big this was internationally. We were watching this with, you know, particularly I'm about the same age, you know, just absolutely wrapped, because we may have been born during the Apollo era, but we were little babies. We don't actually remember any of it. So this was our space program. And until just the other year, this was our space program for our entire lives. It was incredible. So to see that was amazing. And to know the risk those guys are taking now is even more amazing when we think about it. When I finally got to the Cape many years later to see my very first shuttle launch, it was Columbia again, and to round the corner in the bus and see that gleaming white space shuttle, the one I'd seen as a kid sitting there on the pad. I mean, I'm not ashamed to say a tear came to my eye, because I'm like, there it is. There's that one. I sat in that living room waiting for it to go, hoping for it to go all those years. It's an emotional experience I'll never forget.
Yeah, and for me, it's very similar to the bookend experience that Francis has. For me, I wasn't born yet for Mercury. I was too young for Gemini. But for me, my earliest memory as a child, and was of a Saturn V rocket on the TV screen. And for me as a child, what I remember the most about and particularly the early launches, is being a part of that global communal experience of witnessing it on the television. But it wasn't until much later in my life, it wasn't until STS-117, all the way in June 2007, that I actually got to experience my first launch. And I have to tell you, there is no substitute for being there live, for feeling it. The air is electric. Have that sense of anticipation, the sights, the sounds, you feel more a part of it. And that contrast to the global experience of seeing it on the television versus actually physically being there, both of those I view as sort of transformational bookends for me in terms of my experience with spaceflight.
Can I mention here, I also saw STS-117, and I share the thrills that you felt. It was a wonderful experience. When I was growing up, there's no such thing as live TV coverage of launches, because I was at the wrong side of the Atlantic. It wasn't until Apollo that you could sit down and watch it happening live on TV. And I distinctly remember, I think my first live Saturn V launch was Apollo 10, or possibly 8, I don't remember. But the Apollo 11 launch, live on TV, I saw with my family in the TV lounge of a hotel in Switzerland, and I was surrounded by a lot of excited Americans, and we were all watching, and it was a thrilling experience knowing that those men were heading off to the moon. I couldn't have, I can't miss talking about the Apollo Soyuz launch, because actually to stand at Kennedy Space Center after having followed all of the Apollo missions, to actually be there and to see Saturn 1B. Pity it wasn't a Saturn V, but no matter. It was a thrilling experience seeing Tom Stafford's crew heading up into the sky, and it was a beautiful sky, and the sound and the brightness of the engines I will never forget. You just do not get any idea on TV just how bright the exhaust flames are from the engines. So that is a thrill of a lifetime, seeing a live launch of a Saturn rocket from Kennedy Space Center. Absolutely thrilling.
Thank you. I almost feel obligated to say that while this panel firmly recommends that you do go watch a launch in person, we are not advocating that you attend TM2 in person. I got to almost feel bad. Everybody saying, man, it is amazing to be there, but don't. Like, but there will be more. Go. It is awesome.
Absolutely, David. The same science that put people in space is the same science we all should be listening to right now. Do not go to the Cape. NASA is saying do not go to the Cape. The great thing about technology is we can all watch it from home, but yeah, don't put your own life at risk, and most importantly, don't put other people's lives at risk. Please don't go.
Yeah, the technology today is amazing in terms of you know, the global communal experience we had back in the day during Apollo. There were only 44 million television sets in the US at the time, for example. And now everyone's connected. We're hyper connected. We can be taken along virtually in a way that was impossible before. And that feel of being there, you have more now than you ever had before. So please stay safe. And in many ways, you're having your Apollo experience with this now by sharing this global communal experience at the same time with everyone around the world. It amplifies the experience, so stay safe.
I'm like a lot of the panelists. I was born a week after the ASTP landing, so I missed the Apollo era by a week. But that meant that I was old enough then that for STS-1, kind of old enough to know what was going on. It was the first space flight of my life, so it was exciting. My dad, grabbed me one day, put me in front of the TV, here, kid, let's watch this. Arguably that moment kind of shaped the course of where I am now. My son is 6 months old. He's too young to be appreciating Demo 2 this week, but I am so looking forward to him being about the age I was for STS-1 to watch people land on the moon. And that's going to be something kind of cool to get to share with him. But I wanted to follow up a little bit about something that Geoffrey was talking about. We are, this launch, if you follow it on social media, it is #LaunchAmerica, first U.S. launch of a U.S. rocket from U.S. soil carrying U.S. astronauts since 2011. If you've been listening to the panel so far, there's a handful of accents that are a little different than my Southern drawl. I'd love to hear Geoffrey, Emeline, and Francis kind of talk about what does this launch mean to you?
Well, I can start. So, go ahead. Geoffrey, do you want to start? Or?
No. Go ahead, Emeline. You're there. Tell us. Go on.
All right. So just to note, though, so I'm an American. I'm just living in New Zealand, but I also have a Filipino citizenship. So I feel that I'm a global citizen. So for me, I definitely understand, the significance of this being the launch that came back to U.S. soil, and it's exciting. But I think there's two things to note. For one, I always deal with the commercial side of things, and so this is really the very first true private spacecraft that is owned and developed by a true commercial company. So that's like a first, like globally, for orbital flights. The other thing as well is it's essentially the end of a decade-long monopoly of orbital human spaceflight. I mean, I love the Soyuz rocket. It's flown for 1,680 times successfully, and it's been the workhorse of really bringing people up there. But at the same time, because this has always been the only one, it's the only game in town, and the price, if you remember back in 2001, the seat to go up for a private citizen is about $20 million. Today, it's actually twice that amount. And that is true because it's a monopoly. And so now that we have the Dragon, it opens up a whole new world for commercial flights, not just for ISS, but also beyond that. And so, yeah, I think we're going to do a lot to see a lot more things happening after this flight.
Yes, I agree with you about just about everything there. I am delighted to see American astronauts launching back into orbit from American soil. It's taken a long time, but I suppose it's better to do it right than to do it fast. And I will be watching with great excitement to see the launch on Wednesday, assuming it goes ahead on Wednesday. I distinctly remember the 2-day delay in STS-1, which was personally disappointing for me because it affected other plans I had, but I'm sure it was more disappointing for the crew. But this launch, I will be sitting down watching it live on TV, and I will be delighted to see it. I will be keeping my fingers crossed, not very scientific, but I will be hoping the best that everything goes according to plan, and it will be a thrill to watch it.
Yeah, I think the international perspective is something, living in England, growing up in England, and then coming to this country, I realized a lot of people didn't get. And it's one of the reasons Colin Burgess from Australia and I from England started this whole book series was because we thought it was time to start telling some of these stories as stories of people. When I grew up reading American books, it was always America was doing this and that, and then the evil Soviets were doing this in the background, and they had their program too. It was always the other, the enemy. And by the time we're writing post-Cold War, post the end of the Soviet Union, we're thinking, these are all people. Most of them wanted to fly because they wanted to fly. They weren't ardent communists, ardent capitalists. They just wanted to fly airplanes. The way to do that was to join their military. And then they end up being Cold War warriors just because they like flying planes. So one of the reasons we really wanted to get into these books is because of that. And it really brought home just how international a lot of these first missions are. Look at Yuri Gagarin, the first person in space, 1961. Well, while he's still the only person who's flown in orbit, the Americans have done some suborbital flights, but while he's still the only person, he comes to England. First place he's come outside of the Soviet bloc. At that time, England were about 4 minutes away from nuclear annihilation if the Soviets decided to launch all their rockets. America had about 12 minutes, so England was basically the crash test dummy. When we went up in flames, America, it was time to get in the bunkers. So, you're welcome, by the way. So we were basically no reason to like the Soviets. Here comes this guy in a Soviet military uniform, driving down the middle of my hometown of Manchester, England. People coming out in the pouring rain because it's Manchester, England, it rains all the time, literally standing in the pouring rain, 4 or 5 people deep to see Yuri Gagarin. We're talking a couple of years before Beatlemania. The reaction of the humans, the psyche was the same as Beatlemania. It's like, oh my goodness, there's the first guy in space. They were screaming, they're pushing policemen out of the way. Everything you see, and there was old black and white footage of the Beatles arriving anywhere. They did that for Yuri Gagarin, the symbol of the swarm Cold War military enemy. That tells you how much this crosses over these lines. People just are fascinated by space. They're not dumb. They know that this is a propaganda thing. They know that this was to show dominance on the world stage. But nevertheless, there's another part of how people think about it and going, this just happened for us. We did it. We put humans in space. And I think that's something that you'll see this week too. People are very excited about that. Times have changed a lot. Cold War enemies. You talk to the astronauts today, they're up on the space station with Russians, and they will say, you know, when I started training, I was trained to kill that guy who I'm now working with, literally trained to shoot that guy down, and now we're in space together. They can change, we've all changed, and now it's a whole different world. So it's going to be fascinating to see. People all around the world are going to be watching this. Actually, kind of a nice thing when we're all stuck at home, we'll all have something to get behind and get excited about.
Yeah, can I just add a few thoughts to that, David? Obviously, I'm not American, as you can probably tell from my accent. I'm from the UK as well. And yeah, this is a great achievement for the United States. I mean, it's another important milestone on what I think is a very, very important initiative from NASA to kind of open this up and bring in commercial companies. And it's great to see what they've done. But you know, let's not forget, we've been limited to sending up 3 people at a time and bringing back 3 people at a time. And, you know, if you're an astronaut over 6 foot, I don't know what it is, 6'2" or something, you could no longer go up to the space station. But the fact that we're now seeing a craft which is much more capable and which has a much bigger capacity means that we can have a bigger crew on the space station, which means for all of us international partners who pay into it, more science can be done, more research can be done, which, you know, I think has been a limitation on what the space station's been able to achieve since the shuttle was retired. So I think for all of us whose countries are partners in the space station, this is an important flight, and there will be a lot of interest because of that.
Thanks for sharing that.
Hey, David?
Oh, go ahead.
I'd just like to echo what was just said, both from Chris and Francis and everyone else. I think a big shout out has to go to the public affairs folks and those folks who, when they put NASA together, decided to make it a civilian organization with a mandate embedded in its charter for open communication around the world. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that would happen. As Francis pointed out, it was you know, the birth of this, we can't forget, was within a geopolitical struggle, right? Within the military. And even the early NASA launches were started as really with a closed mentality of keeping things top secret. But there was a great struggle internally and externally to make as much information as freely available to the world as possible, and to move from, you know, a fire in the tail mentality of you can't tell anybody about this launch down at the Cape until the rocket is actually in the air and going somewhere, to a T+3 or a week before the launch and many days before the launch, that helped create this global experience and got everybody around it to say we and not they and just the Americans. And so as we map out in Marketing the Moon, I really just want to hand it to all those people, whether it's at SpaceX or whether it's at NASA and just across the supply chain, who work in the trenches of marketing and communications, that push cameras, that push direct video feeds, and that bring us all there now. More important than ever in a pandemic situation, but in this idea of all of us sharing in the launch, nothing could be more important.
Thank you. Francis, I'm going to jump back to you for a second. I mentioned earlier that that this is the 5th first for the U.S. crew flight. I believe it's 9th total international. Your first 2 books, Into the Silent Sea and In the Shadow of the Moon, I think are probably the best comprehensive worldwide telling of that, not the US space race story or the Soviet space race story, but the story as a whole. Coming from that perspective, kind of tell us, I think of those 9, I think the first 6 of them are covered in those 2 books. Kind of give us a perspective of what this means and what it was like making those first 6 first flights.
Thank you, David, for those really kind words about the books. That was definitely our intention, to try and cover everything from an international point of view. This whole conversation is also reminding me of when I saw the second space flight of Spaceship One, and I'm realizing we've had all kinds of different firsts along the way. You know, that was different when somebody lands a spacecraft gets out, comes over and shakes your hand as you're standing on that doesn't happen on the shuttle, you know, a little different. But no, very true. I mean, I was thinking about that last night when I was reading through some of the things you might want to talk about today and thinking about what these had in common and what they had with different. Every time somebody's sitting on top of a spacecraft for the first time, knowing this is the first launch, it's going to be an interesting day. It's going to be an interesting time because it doesn't matter whether that spacecraft like this one this week has been test launched unmanned many, many times, or it's like the shuttle, which had never been tested at all before people are on top of it. Some of them are going to be safer, some of them are going to be not, but it's never been done this way before. And that's going to be a moment, and they're going to choose the right person for that right moment. I think looking back now on those early Soyuz and Vostok and the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, they were done, as you mentioned earlier, in a very different time, a time of Cold War race to the moon. And now it seems almost impossible that they got those spacecraft done so quick. The idea that they were getting Mercury and Gemini off the pad so quick, developing the next ones. Of course, it caught up with them with Apollo 1 and the Apollo 1 fire. There is a lot of inherent danger in going too fast. But the fact that they were able to put those together so quickly, basically in the time we've been waiting now from the shuttle and next week, they did all of that. It just reminds me how incredible that was, that the engineers could do that. That's not to say engineers today can't do that. Engineers today can do that. They just don't get given the huge amount of money and national push that happened during the Cold War. It's a real reminder for those who say, well, we could do it back in Apollo, why can't we do it now? We can do it now. There are bright people like you, David, working on SLS and stuff who make incredible things happen. They just don't get that same Cold War push behind them. Overall, that's a great thing. I don't want to be in a thermonuclear brinksmanship race with anybody right now. I lived through the Cold War as a kid, and I didn't like it very much. I was so glad when the threat of immediate nuclear war seemed to reduce dramatically. Particularly being in the middle of Europe, we were in the middle of all of it. You know, we were where it would have happened. But having said that, it is a shame that we don't have some kind of push to make it happen. So I'm really looking forward to this week. We're going to see people sitting on a launch pad, making history for the first time since those early days, as I describe in those books. Yuri Gagarin sitting on top of a rocket. He's never even traveled to a foreign country in his life. The first time he sees anywhere outside of the Soviet Union is when he's in orbit looking down at Japan going, that's a foreign country. Talk about, you know, widening your horizons. What I love about your book, David, you know, your second book is that you get into the shuttle program. And I think this week really reminds us how risky that program was. What an incredible thing it was for those two test pilots to sit on top of a rocket and go, okay, all of this has to work. None of it's ever been tested together before in this way. And we're either going to make it into space or we're going to die. And there really is not much between that. We learned too late. We learned later how risky the shuttle was. And it really makes us think about that first flight again. So thank goodness there's been so much more testing with unmanned launches for next week's rocket before that's going to happen, because yeah, we're in the middle of history and it's going to be fascinating. And I look forward to all of you, whoever it's going to be, writing the next book about this moment right now. It's going to be great.
There's an official NASA history of the Gemini program called On the Shoulders of Titans, which is a very, very clever title. I'm a little jealous of whoever came up with that. But there's a lot of truth to it. You know, there's the Planetary Society came out in the past week or so with a story about what a great deal economically this commercial crew launch is compared to past programs. You know, here's how much we spent on Gemini, and here's how much we spent on Apollo, and here's how much we spent on Mercury. But like you're kind of hitting on, Francis, I mean, you know, today we have the benefit of the fact, can you do, you know, rendezvous and docking? Well, yeah, you know, thankfully Gemini proved that for us back in the 60s. You know, can you put multiple people on a spacecraft? Can you, you know, can you dock to a spacecraft and transfer people between them? And so we are, you know, we're so blessed today to have, you know, the foundation of everything that came before that we're able to build from. I got a question in on the Q&A that thankfully was literally the next question on my list, and that's for Chris. You know, of course, so the fourth of those 5 U.S. launches is STS-1. You've got some knowledge and some experience with that. And in addition to that, spaceflight is not just limited to orbital vehicles. I believe there's been 2 or 3 space planes that have awarded astronaut wings as well. Your book covers rocket planes. Give us the things with wings perspective on first flights.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously we've just talked a bit about STS-1 and how high the stakes were on that mission. And I was talking about how, to me, that was the thing, that was the first mission I saw. But in no way did I realize just how much was at stake in that one flight. And it kind of was the latest link in a long tradition of test flying. And looking at the rocket planes, which particularly interests me, the rocket research aircraft, and there was a series of them stretching from 1945 pretty much up to the time that the shuttle was being built in the factory out at Palmdale. And they generally had a pretty checkered history on their first flights. I mean, there was very, very few of them worked as advertised on the first flight. Generally, they had the luxury of having glide flights on the first flights, but there was always a time when somebody had to flick that switch and there'd be a rocket motor sitting just a couple of feet behind you. Well, the rocket motor was quite a long way back, but then you had a tank of hydrogen peroxide and a tank of alcohol and a tank of liquid oxygen and various other combustible materials, not least of which would have been the pilot. So yeah, I mean, I think that's really where American technology cut its teeth and allowed those very rapid steps to be taken with Mercury and with Gemini to really, in a very short amount of time, have the confidence in engineering. I mean, it was no coincidence that North American got the Apollo job after the X-15. But yeah, I mean, the X-1, first flight, bad landing, came up short of the field, broke the undercarriage. Douglas skyrocket barely got into the air because it was so underpowered, very unstable when it got there. X-15, Scott Crossfield nearly crashed it landing because of control problems. All of them had problems. And then we saw that, obviously STS-1, it kind of came out a little bit later, quite how serious the problems were. And now we kind of look towards some of the newer rocket planes, the Spaceship 1 and then Spaceship 2. They've not been without their issues either. And they are still in the experimental phase. I mean, I know they're going to start flying the public soon, but people should be under no illusions that at the point somebody starts up that rocket motor just behind you, I think somebody said earlier, things are going to happen. You're going somewhere. And you hope it's the right direction and you hope it's under control, but it's a real test, first flights.
Thank you. And I'll note, I went ahead and did that question because, like I said, it was literally the next one on my sheet anyway. I am seeing a couple of more pictures, a couple more questions pop up in the Q&A. I've got I'm going to let each of the panelists kind of run through their individual story, and then we will get back to you for the questions and answers. So if you have them, please keep submitting them, and we will get back to you. But first, so the flight readiness review for Demo 2 just wrapped up yesterday. They started on Thursday, decided it'd be better to extend it another day to have a little bit more conversation, and they wrapped that up yesterday successfully, getting ready for launch this week. But man, those management decisions, making that go no go call to move ahead with the space flight, to when to know that you're ready, how to manage that risk, those can be some weighty and heady decisions to make. Richard's book kind of dives very deep into that issue. Richard, would you be willing to kind of share with us a little bit about George Lowe and his experience making some of those heavy calls?
Yeah, sure, David. That really goes to the heart of George Lowe's story, really throughout his entire career. And I'm asked this question actually a lot in researching Lowe's life story and in writing the book. I've kind of responded to that question by bucketizing his philosophy towards go, no go, towards risk and reward by looking at it philosophically. How did he approach it philosophically? Practically, how did he apply it in the practical sense? And then finally, his own personal perspective as an engineer. So if I can go through those three buckets real quick. Philosophically, Lowe always felt from the earliest days that the risk and the reward need to be balanced. As Francis said earlier, you can't eliminate risk. It's a risky business, space flight, just like getting up in the morning can be risky. Getting into your car can be risky. You can reduce risk, you can manage risk, you can mitigate risk, but you can't eliminate risk. But the key to progress is accepting that risk, pushing that risk in a calculated way in order to move things along. But in order to accept that risk, the rewards in Lowe's mind had to be worth it and had to balance. So I give an example, even in the earliest days in 1959, he was on the GET committee, the first earliest committee to try and decide NASA's long-range plans and goals. And Lowe was considered the original moon zealot. He was considered very passionate because he felt strongly that given the amount of money that would be needed and given the risk in terms of lives to develop our spacefaring capability, that only a lunar landing, not Earth orbit, not lunar orbit, but a lunar landing would balance out the cost and the risk and develop the highest return for our technology and industrial base. And so philosophically, risk and reward need to be balanced. Practically though, in many ways, when you read Lowe's story and you read Jim Webb's story or any administrator's story or any program manager's story, they're operating on a multi-dimensional chess board of thinking about political risk and decision, budgetary risk and decision, schedule and decision, technical risk and decision, medical, we could go on and we could list every layer to that, each one very important. One of the insights, and there are many in the Lowe book, we could spend all day talking about each of those layers on the chessboard of the decision-making process. But it was very clear to me from Lowe, from the earliest days and throughout his career, that the worst decision-making was when the political decisions on the chessboard outweighed the technical decisions. First example being Alan Shepard being the first American into space. And we kind of tell that story of how Lowe felt we were cheated out of that because there were technical issues that he and Gilruth and Faget and Croft and Slayton all felt that they had fixed and the craft was ready to go, that the risk was worth it to launch. But politically, people felt that if there was a death on the pad that early in the program could not survive. And they needed more test flights to prove it. So they missed out by just a few weeks being first in space. Here we were years behind the Soviets in spacefaring capability. Here we missed that goal by just a few weeks. And Lowe never forgot that. He kept that in the back of his mind for the Apollo 8 decision, which Lowe viewed as perhaps the highlight for him, even above Apollo 11. It was the emotional pinnacle of the program for him, deciding to go for lunar orbit when the lunar module wasn't ready. And he did that because he knew technically they were ready to do it, but the politicians were afraid of, so soon after the Apollo 1 fire, that they would risk such an attempt. But Lowe and the other technically minded people dominated on that, and it won the day. Finally, it's the personal, the engineer in him, in terms of the risk management decision, the dirty hands engineer in him. And the only time he really worked as a true engineer was when he was the Apollo program manager after the Apollo 1 fire. And it was not lost on him that lives are at risk, that those who climb into that capsule are putting their faith not only in the program manager, but everyone along the supply chain and in every decision that they make. And Lowe famously said that he liked to put himself ahead in time, not space. And for every decision he made, he would ask himself, how would I feel at midnight in mission control if something went wrong? If something went wrong in the decision I made. So he created two unbreakable rules at that time as Apollo program manager. One, absolute attention to detail. Nothing was too big, nothing was too small. He didn't manage from behind his desk. He got out in the field. He went to the contractors. He did the simulations with the astronauts. He checked switches. He checked circuit breakers and test. The second rule that he had for himself was learn to ask the right questions. It's not about being a dictator, but it's about simply asking questions, because by asking questions, the person who's answering it, you can find out, do they know their stuff? Do they know what they're talking about? And as a famous example, he would put up the Apollo 1 door. That door, after the issues around Gus Grissom's flight during Mercury, when the door came off the spacecraft and we lost the spacecraft in the ocean, if you were to design a perfectly engineered door that would stay closed and protect the astronauts in space, the Apollo 1 door, as originally designed, was perfect. But for emergency egress and a fire on the pad, it was a death trap. No one asked themselves the right question, which was, what do you do if you have to have that emergency egress? So he was personally paranoid about not only paying attention to detail, but constantly questioning, constantly pushing to see, what did we think about, what did we not? Because ultimately he knew, to wrap this up, that at the end of the day at breakfast, when he would look those astronauts in the eye before launch and shake their hands, he was handing it off. He was saying, I did the best I could for you up to this point. Now it's up to you. And as said earlier, we know we're going up, we know we're going somewhere, but it all depends. There's no substitute for actual flight testing. And that's the way Lowe looked at it, philosophically, practically, and personally.
Thank you very much. Geoffrey, so
Yes.
We've been talking about first flights from a vehicle perspective, the first flight of Shuttle, the first Dragon, the first flight of Vostok. When you're the astronaut, it doesn't matter how many times that vehicle is flown. When you step into it for the first time, it's a first flight. Apollo 17 was to the world, it's the final flight. I mean, that's what we remember it for, is a last. But if you're Ron Evans getting into that vehicle, it's it doesn't matter what the world has experienced. It matters what Ron Evans experiences stepping into that spacecraft. From your experience and your knowledge working on that biography, what was that question, that dynamic of excitement versus risk versus mission like for him as he's getting ready for that
button? Right, Ron Evans. I think I'd probably be right in saying that most of you have only ever seen the briefest of biographies of Ron Evans. You look up even on Wikipedia or anywhere, you'll see about a page about Ron Evans. And I think it's high time people got to read the full story of Ron Evans, because he was one of only 24 human beings in all history to visit the moon. And that is a story worth telling. And in his case, it is a fascinating story. And it's not just the Apollo part of the story. So let's bear in mind, Ron was a fighter pilot in the US Navy. He didn't go knocking on NASA's door. The Navy came to him and said, you meet the criteria that NASA has set for astronaut selection. Would you like us, the US Navy, to put your name forward? And he said, yes, please. So it was the Navy who basically volunteered him and other candidates for astronaut selection. And Ron had never thought about it until 1963, when he was first put forward by the Navy. And he wasn't selected that time, but he was selected the second time his name came up. But until then, Ron had never thought about exploration. He had, as far as he was concerned, he was a Navy pilot. That was his career. But once he became an astronaut, then he realized he had the opportunity to explore. And he always said that what he wanted to do was get his boots dirty on the moon, literally. But even though he didn't get to walk on the moon, he was delighted, absolutely delighted, to be selected as a command module pilot and to fly on Apollo 17. And of course, it gave him the opportunity to explore the whole of the moon by going around it in orbit. But by the time the launch came up, in the words of Jan Evans, Ron was raring to go. And I think that by the time he got to climb into the command module, he was really excited. I don't think that he was particularly concerned. I think they all recognized that there was always a risk, but it was a risk that they thought was manageable. And certainly in his case, he was quite happy to go, no problem about that. I think you have to bear in mind that he had been a fighter pilot. He had been flying combat missions over North Vietnam. He had been shot at. His aircraft had been hit by bullets. He had had to dodge anti-aircraft missiles. Nobody was going to be shooting at him going to the moon. So in a strange way, it's safer for Ron Evans to fly to the moon than to do multiple combat missions. So that was an aspect which didn't apply to most of the astronauts, where they had already seen what risk really was. So in comparison, flying to the moon for Ron Evans was not such a big risk. But you could see as he went to the launch pad, you could see how excited he was. He actually tried, I think it looks like he tried to jump up and click his heels. And unfortunately, the weight of the suit and Earth's gravity was a bit too much to allow the heels to click. But he was clearly in a very good mood about to go to the moon. But he did have two concerns. This might be surprising. Farouk El-Baz, who the geologist who had trained him, knew that Ron was a little concerned that because it was the last Apollo mission, all of the scientists had tried to pile every possible experiment onto Ron's shoulders. They weren't going to have another chance, so they said, okay, Ron's going to have to do this, he's going to have to do this, and the list of experiments piled up. And Ron confided in Farouk El-Baz, look, I just hope I can actually do all of this because it's a lot you're asking me to do. But Farouk had faith in him. He knew Ron could do it, and he was right. The second problem, I'm sure, was concerning him was when he was a midshipman in the US Navy, he always got seasick on his midshipman cruises. He loved them, but he always got seasick. He found his sea legs once he was on aircraft carriers, but on the KC-135, the aptly named Vomit Comet, Ron always threw up, and that was a serious concern. He did not get through a complete cycle of 30 or 40 of those circuits in the KC-135. He always threw up, and he was seriously worried that he might be one of those astronauts who would have a problem in space. As it turned out, he was okay. Like most of them, he had a little queasiness in the early days, but after that, never looked back, not a problem. And I think one of the reasons why probably people remember him as being very exuberant on his spacewalk was because by then he realized, I can do this, I'm not getting seasick, or space sick rather, I can do this, I've got the experiments covered, and then he could actually enjoy the spacewalk. But as far as the launch itself is concerned, I think that you only have to listen to the soundtrack of the launch and you can tell that Ron is really enjoying himself. I mean, you hear things like woohoo and man, oh man, this thing shakes like a son of a gun. But it was when they actually got into orbit, he came out with his famous expression, which is better remembered on the spacewalk. On the first orbit, he said, hot diggity dog, I can't believe we made it up here. And that's an interesting point. Again, people remember Ron doing the spacewalk, saying hot diggity dog and waving to his family. And they think that he was this ultra exuberant astronaut, but he was always known to his fellow fighter pilots as very quiet. He was actually called the quiet man of the squadron. Gene Kranz referred to him as the ultra quiet Ron Evans. So it depended whether he was working hard on getting Apollo ready or actually flying in space. Whether he was the quiet Ron Evans or the exuberant Ron Evans. But Joe Engel told me actually he wasn't at all surprised that Ron was exuberant on the spacewalk because, quote, spaceflight is exciting. And I think any astronaut would tell you that. Farouk El-Baz told me that, in his opinion, Ron Evans was one of the unsung heroes of Project Apollo. And he was always there in the background doing the support crew work and then backup crew. And then, in a sense, he got his reward. After 6.5 years, he got his flight. And Apollo 17 was a fantastic success. And could I just finish? I just want to read a quotation that I discovered when I was researching this book. It's something that a man named Harry Jensen, who subsequently died, wrote. He contributed this to a website dedicated to those people who had flown in or worked on the F-8 Crusader. And what he wrote was that he had been a plane captain working, basically an engineer working on servicing the Crusaders on board the USS Oriskany in 1960 when Ron was flying off that aircraft carrier. And he wrote, "The pilot who flew the plane I was responsible for was later to become astronaut Ron Evans, who was the pilot of the command module on the last moonshot with Cernan and Schmidt. It was plain to see why he was picked for the program. A finer man would be hard to find." Now that's an unsolicited comment by a man who worked with Ron Evans and remembered him. So when you think of Ron's exuberant spacewalk and hot diggity dog, remember there's another side, a calm, measured, hard-working pilot and astronaut who did tremendous work in Project Apollo and finally got to fly to the moon, and he thoroughly enjoyed his mission.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I wanted to jump back to where you started, which is a good time to throw in a word from our sponsor, a quick commercial break here. Yeah, so this Outward Odyssey series, we've kind of alluded to it. This is a series of spaceflight history books published by the University of Nebraska Press. I'm obviously a little bit biased, but I would argue with anybody that this is the most comprehensive series of spaceflight history books around, and an amazing social history of spaceflight, telling not just the technical information, but the very real human stories, the experiences that made it happen. And I had a somewhat similar experience. I was doing some NASA education writing back in 2003 and was working on an article for kids about Skylab and was researching that, and man, there's not a lot out there about this program. You know, somebody should write a book about it. And it took me a while to realize that someone was me. But yeah, the fact that there is a place, that there's a publisher that authors like Geoffrey can go to, that, you know, hey, there's a void here, there's a vacuum here. You know, you go on Wikipedia, you get a few paragraphs about this guy. History deserves better. Is just such a wonderful thing. So I'm grateful to University of Nebraska Press for publishing this series. I'm grateful to Geoffrey and to the other authors here for taking that effort to preserve that history. I'm actually going to do a quick go back to Francis, whose third Outward Odyssey book was this just amazing treasure of a lost manuscript from an Apollo astronaut. Similar sort of thing to the Ron Evans, making his first flight. Francis, what do you want to tell us about Apollo Pilot?
First off, my day is now made because I've heard hot diggity dog done in a Belfast accent, and that's nothing I ever thought I'd hear in my life. I love it. Love it. But yeah, the book Apollo Pilot, this is the third one I did, as you mentioned, and this was a researcher's dream, and it totally ties in with our theme of first flights, because Don Isley is the forgotten crew member from the very first Apollo mission. He's the first Apollo navigator on the Apollo 7 mission. And he died in 1987. He died a lot earlier than a lot of these guys wrote their biographies. And a lot of the later Apollo astronaut biographies are pretty sanitized. They're pretty cleaned up. I had the immense good fortune. I was staying with his widow, and she said, go through the closet. I got all kinds of family junk in there. You know, most people have a family junk closet. When you're the widow of an Apollo astronaut, it includes flags and patches and pins flown in space. It includes bits of the spacecraft. It includes all kinds of treasures. In there was the typewritten first draft of a couple of books he'd been trying to work on, including a first-hand account of the very first Apollo flight. And it really gave me some insight into what we're talking about today, because it's a very military mindset in that you are working in a program. You are publicly very on board. You are publicly rah-rahing everything. And yet behind the scenes, there's a lot of dissent. There's a lot of conversation about safety, particularly with that crew. The last time somebody had tried to fly an Apollo mission, they died. The Apollo 1 crew had died, as we've been talking about. And these guys get told, hey, they died, you're next. Imagine how that felt. So he is in space. He is hyper aware of safety. He is hypercritical of people on the ground when they're not doing what they need to do to keep the crew safe and keep the mission going well. Turned out to be an incredibly successful flight. They, a little bit like the Ron Evans flight that Geoffrey was talking about, they crammed in extra stuff. They did about 110% of their flight objectives because they actually got given more. But here's a guy behind the scenes who's saying, this is something we did not like safety-wise. For the launch, for example, they broke some rules. They were supposed to not launch if the wind was going to blow them back onto land. If they had to do an emergency abort, the parachutes would have taken them out to ocean unless the wind was going in the right direction. They were not designed to land safely and survive a land landing. The wind was wrong. Had they had an unplanned abort, they would have crashed on land, maybe with some injuries, maybe with some fatalities. They launched anyway. Don Isley was not happy about that. Fascinating insights, but it's the kind of stuff you don't hear firsthand until you talk to these guys years later. I'm reminded of Hoot Gibson talking about the flight he made a couple of flights after the Challenger disaster. He was commanding a shuttle flight, and there was huge tile damage under the shuttle. And he knew it. He could see it on camera. They didn't say anything publicly, partly because it was a military classified mission. But he was flying back, and he told me years later, if I'd felt the shuttle beginning to go out of control, a little bit like happened on Columbia years later, I would have used those last few seconds to really give mission control a piece of my mind. And I thought, wow, I could not have saved that until that moment. I would be shouting at them the moment I realized that there'd been a problem and the shuttle was compromised. But it gives you an insight into these guys. They're going to fly this mission professionally, safely, correctly. There'll be a lot of behind the scenes discussions about safety. But I encourage you to look at the Don Isley book, because it really does give you a firsthand account as to some of the things these guys will be thinking about next week, which is, this is an untried vehicle for people to sit inside, and what's it going to be like? We're not going to know until it happens.
Thank you. So I'm going to pivot for just a bit. We've been talking about the first flight angle of the significance of this week's launch, but it's also, as Emeline touched on earlier, very historic for its role in commercial space flight. Now, we talk about it as, this is the beginning of commercial space flight. This is a dawn for commercial space flight. The reality is, if you read Melvin and John's book, commercial space flight's been going on for a little bit. Melvin, why don't you tell us about the true dawn of commercial human spaceflight with the Space Shuttle Payload Specialist program?
Yeah, I have a background in risk assessment, so I love writing this book. NASA flew payload specialists with a variety of backgrounds: scientists, military people, politicians, went through a Saudi prince, goes on and on. And they only received a couple months of training versus years of training like the NASA astronauts get. and they learn how to use the potty, which isn't easy, and emergency egress, but not the innards of the shuttle like the NASA astronauts. So I always wondered, do they really understand the risk? I always wanted to see a probability risk assessment of the shuttle. And real quickly what that is, it's comprised of 3 parts. One, you identify an event, and that's usually an old crap event. Something's going to go wrong and it's bad, kill you. Then you need to know what's the probability of that event occurring, and then you want to know what the impact is. And in this case, the impact was loss of crew and vehicle. Was talking with Rick Houck about 5 years ago about this, and he says, I have one of those PRAs for the shuttle, I'll send it to you. Great. I wasn't really surprised. The first 4 launches of shuttle, there was a 1 in 12 chance they were going to die. And when they disabled those ejection seats, guess what? The risk went up to 1 in 10 chance and held up through the Challenger disaster at that risk. I read something from Bob Sinker after the Challenger explosion. Some people said that Kristen McAuliffe should not be on that flight because she didn't understand the risk. And he didn't like that. He said, hey, in training, she would ask questions. What happens if that goes wrong? Event. The answer often was loss of crew and vehicle. She knew the impact, but nowhere in there was there any discussion about the probability. And that's the hard part. So again, did she understand it? Here's what Rick told me about his flights. He flew 3 missions that returned to flight on Challenger after Challenger. And he said, had I known that one of the first 25 flights of the shuttle was going to result in loss of crew and vehicle, I don't think I would have signed up to fly 3 of the first 26. So here's a test pilot who may not have understood it. So there's a belief in that from some that maybe it's not ethical to fly these people. So fast forward now, we're going to put 2 talented astronauts on a Dragon, on a Falcon rocket, and send them up into space. They understand the risk probably better than anybody. But we're going to start flying scientists on these missions at some point, or these commercial people will. They'll fly a wide variety of people, different backgrounds, tourists. And the question is, do they understand the risk? Will they understand it? So that's the dilemma we have to deal with. But I think the lower space flight, people ignore the risk and they'll fly. I'll leave you with one comment from Paul Scully Power, a colorful Australian oceanographer who flew as a payload specialist. He said, you either make it or you don't.
I had the opportunity to work with in marketing for a senior living facility, a active adult retirement community, and one of the gentlemen there, inspired by former U.S. George Bush, who would jump out of an airplane every 5 years for his birthday, decided he was going to do the same thing. And so he and his wife, into their 80s and approaching their 90s, would occasionally just go out skydiving. And he said that somebody asked his wife one time, isn't that dangerous? Do you really need to be doing that? And he said she looked at the person, said, if that's how the good Lord has for me to die, I'd better get up there. So amen to that. Jumping ahead, we've looked backwards for the commercial space aspect. Look ahead. Emeline, you talked a little bit about the importance of this earlier, ending the monopoly, what it means today, but take me a little ways into the future. What are we looking at the birth of? What does this look like, 5, 10, 15, 50 years from now because of what we're seeing this?
No, I actually really think that it's such an exciting time, and I'm really jealous that the next generation is going to be the one that's really going to benefit from this. So for one, what's the significance of D2, which I already said, it's kind of like it's the first sort of real private commercial flight. It's also we're in an era of reusable rockets now as well, which was not available before. The thing also is that today we have one destination in low Earth orbit, and that's the International Space Station. And there's a reason for that. It's because we do not have a frequent, reliable, secure, real spacecraft that can go up and down fast enough to bring astronauts and cosmonauts up. And so, from the time that the shuttle retired, we've only had like every time it's only 3 people that's going up every few months. This is now the opportunity for more flights to go up, and the fact that because that has happened as well. I mean, for the past 2 decades, really, there has been companies like Bigelow Aerospace who have been wanting to actually create a destination in space. You know, you've heard about like space hotels, you've heard about free flying research labs, but those will not exist because we don't have an actual, vehicle that can go up and down fairly frequently. I think this is sort of like the moment where we have that opportunity. And today we've got companies like, Axiom to Nanoracks that are actually working on potentially these free flying space stations. Commercial space stations. And again, the technology has been around for ages. If you remember back in 2006, 2007, Bigelow actually already launched 2 kind of prototypes of these inflatable modules. But again, it's taken a while because we do not have a vehicle. So I think with that, we are going to have a lot more commercial sort of like modules and destinations up in space for the next decade or so. The other thing as well with SpaceX, I mean, Elon Musk doesn't really do anything kind of in isolation. His long-term vision here is to go to Mars and to settle Mars. And I think the Dragon is just one step in terms of really understanding and validating the technology for long-term duration and life support systems that will hopefully take us there in kind of like in the future. So yeah, it's definitely pretty exciting.
Thank you. I remember as a kid watching 2001: A Space Odyssey. And you at the beginning of that movie, you've got the the Pan Am space clipper flying up to the Hilton Hotel in orbit, and the whole life never doubted that that's where we're going. It's been very interesting, like you talked about, the Bigelow experiences, watching how messy it is getting there. But yeah, it's it's exciting to see that we're closer to 2001 today than we were in 2001.
Definitely.
I'm going to, that was the questions that I had for the individual panelists. I had a few other questions, but before I get into those, I was going to give our audience a chance to chime in. Got a question from Richard Easton. Which of the 4 U.S. first flights were the most dangerous, and which did we learn the most from? Anybody want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. They all were, right? I think of the first flights, they all had their different risks. We learned different things from each one. What I find amazing, even when you hear Jeff talk about Apollo 17 and Ron's flight, if you read those post-flight interviews and discussions, they're still talking about things to improve, even though there wasn't another Apollo scheduled to fly, right? And so I think everything's iterative in building space vehicles and reaching out into space. I think if you go back to just the earliest visions of space, what Elon Musk and even Jeff Bezos with Blue Origin are doing with reusable rockets harkens back to a Chesley Bonstall painting where you see, or a Forbidden Planet film. And we talked about landing on the moon, making science fiction into science fact, but it took several generations for the technology to settle into the industrial base, for us to develop the technology, to move forward in software and vision, and people who were inspired by the events back then to be able to put them into practical application for today. So I think we're at an inflection point. And it's kind of hard to pick just one flight because each flight taught us something along that iterative step to get us to where we're at today. Dragon's been flying for what, 8 years, since 2012. They've learned a lot in those years. They're going to learn even more now with it being human rated with humans aboard. But each flight, I think it was also said earlier, is its own first. You know, you look at the conversations in the media right now, the rightful conversations around load and go, around the levels of automation that you're finding now. Just look at an Apollo capsule or look at the bridge of the shuttle and all the switches and the circuit breakers and the toggle switches versus, you know, you look inside the Dragon, it's a panel, right? Everything's been automated. Everything's been done behind the scenes. And you have to hope that programming, that the simulation, that the testing, that the thinking through, that the asking the right questions was complete. So I know it's going to sound like a flippant answer, but which one did we learn the most from? All of them, right? All of them help us get to here because you can't just take one out because of the complexity of it. It is all iterative. We are, you know, the shoulders of Titans, right? That great title that you talked about, David. We are here because of what happened before, and we will be where we're going to be 5 years or 10 years from now because of what's going to happen on Tuesday and what's going to happen with the next launches. It's just exciting to see that generational application of this, whether Apollo generation, shuttle generation, now on to Artemis generation, Dragon generation, SpaceX generation, you name it. Moving on. That's how I would answer that question.
Looking at it from an international point of view, David, I think that the first flight of the Soyuz obviously was the most dangerous because it killed the guy who was flying it. That spacecraft was not ready to fly when it did. The ones that are successful, though, look at Voskhod. That was insane. That was absolutely insane, and the kind of thing that nobody should ever do again. To give you some background, you know, the Russians had flown Yuri Gagarin on the Vostok. They'd flown 6 flights on that. They knew America was about to do a 2-person Gemini flight. So they said, well, how can we beat them in the propaganda headlines? So they put 3 people in space at once, way ahead of Apollo, even ahead of Gemini, and the general public in the West, and even in the East, where all this was on the top secret, went, wow, the Soviets are already ahead of Apollo, putting 3 people in space at once. How did they do that? They took a 1-person spacecraft and they crammed 3 people into it. The only way you can do that is you can't have any spacesuits. You've got to be crammed together. There wasn't even room to put couches across. They were above each other, below each other. And they could stay up there for just about 1 day. They had about enough oxygen to do that. Tried a totally new landing system instead of ejecting from the spacecraft like Gagarin and the Vostok people had done. They had to come down with rockets that were going to thump them down on a hard landing like the Soyuz later did successfully. But this was the first time they'd done that. That was probably the riskiest first flight that was successful of any of them because everything about that flight was stupid just to get headlines. When it comes to American flights, though, I have to say Shuttle that was the most dangerous first flight, even before it got off the pad. And you can't test this stuff. They fire those engines and the amount of acoustic vibration and other rattling around that happens, you've seen it, we've all seen it in those films. That was way more than they expected. When you see launches now, when you look at those old shuttle launches, there's huge pipes of water, there's a huge deluge of water coming onto that pad. They did not know what that shuttle was going to do because they'd never even done that, and they didn't have enough water. So those vibrations actually bounced back up, started damaging the bottom of the shuttle, started slamming some doors shut that couldn't open. John Young later said, if he'd have known the damage that was made to the shuttle before they'd even taken off, he would have ejected. He wouldn't have flown it. Fortunately, in a way, he didn't know what the damage was, and the rest of the mission was successful. But that shuttle was damaging itself on the pad before it even launched. Then you look at what happens as they start going into orbit. Almost every other spacecraft, you have rockets on the top that can pull away that crew cabin. They can get away from an exploding rocket. The things that first shuttle had to do, if something went wrong at certain minutes, they were supposed to literally turn around in space and fire the rockets backwards to start coming down, to somehow get to a launch pad. Theoretically, some of it was possible, but none of those commanders really ever had any store that that was going to happen. There were key minutes of that launch of any shuttle where any chance of survival was pretty slim. So thank goodness, in a way, we're not doing that in terms of safety. Now, that's not to say whether it was worth the risk or not. That's a whole other conversation. And obviously, everybody got in that shuttle that knew the risk, understood that. But in terms of the riskiest, I've got to say shuttle was by far the riskiest.
And talking about the protection seats, I mentioned the Gemini Dragon comparison earlier. You know, they both carrying multiple people into space, both doing rendezvous. Another thing they have in common among American spacecraft capsules, they're both launched without a launch abort tower. But man, I will take the Super Draco over the Gemini ejection seats any day. That's progress. Richard, you had a comment, and then Geoffrey, I'll let you in after.
Oh yeah, you know, Francis, you guys bring up some great points, and Francis really hit the nail on the head. I mean, failure is unfortunately the biggest way that we learn. And you know, Francis talking about Apollo 7 and the risk those guys took so soon after the fire to get into that capsule is astounding to me. You know, Lowe talks about in later interviews that what happened during Apollo 1 was an absolute tragedy. It never should have happened for many reasons. But if that had not happened, there's a good chance we never would have gotten to the moon. There were thousands of things wrong. Engineering changes made to the command module. Thousands of engineering changes made to the lunar module. There were over 400 engineering change requests that hadn't even been addressed when they stepped into that capsule when they died. And it's that balance of reward versus the cost. I think it's why everybody post the Apollo 1 fire felt it such a personal mission to not let their deaths be in vain, but to improve the spacecraft and improve the process. And you think about the risks people took on the shuttle as well and the other ones, it is mind-boggling. And but failure, unfortunately, is sometimes the only way we can make those giant leaps.
Geoffrey?
Sorry, did you ask for me?
Were you wanting to, did you have something?
Yes, yes. Well, I wanted to say that, of course, it wasn't just the relative risks of, say, John Glenn's Atlas versus Gus Grissom and John Young's Titan II. A lot of it was to do with what was on top of the capsule. John Glenn had an escape rocket. The Gemini capsule did not have an escape rocket. They had to rely on rather unreliable, as I understood it, ejection seats. So risk is not just about the rocket, whether the rocket will explode, but whether the launch system will get the crew away from an exploding rocket. And the one thing we know about escape rockets is they have been seen to work. There's a Soyuz crew that escaped from an exploding launch vehicle on the pad because their escape rocket worked. So I think that the crew of the Dragon demo flight next week will have the reassurance of knowing that they've got an escape rocket on top of their capsule. And if the rocket itself goes wrong, then there is a proper means of escape. And I think that that surely has to be one of the mitigation factors in assessing relative risks between, say, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, Shuttle, and now the Dragon mission.
All right, thank you. Two questions from Avi. These are related questions going back to, I think, to Richard's talk earlier. Is there appetite for political risk today, and has the political risk passed the technical risk appetite? Anybody have thoughts on that?
I don't think there's the same appetite for political risk. There's a big appetite for political reward, but not necessarily understanding the risks involved in that, or being prepared to take the consequences if things do go wrong. it's very easy to commit to programs and make bold statements about where you're going to be in set periods of time, but engineering rarely works to presidential terms or any other external timescale. And yeah, whether I'd expect a politician to really be the person that understands the risk, but you know, you'd certainly hope that somebody makes them more aware of it when they come to make the big statements.
I think if I can jump in, I think you're spot on, Chris, and I think it's the importance of the rise of private space with the big capital P public space run by governments. You know, Virgin Galactic had a tragic test flight, yet they still kept going. What you have with Musk and Bezos and hundreds and hundreds of other companies investing money, risking lives, and setting goals. I think somebody had mentioned earlier Musk's long-term vision of where he wants to go, independent of what's being done on behalf of governmental space agencies and their goals, is a rather exciting development. And I think governments political risk will always be there. And one of the problems in the post-Apollo world, some would argue, probably rightfully, that we also went to the moon because it was the vision of a dead president that no one wanted to destroy. And it froze the political decision. And actually politics helped in that situation. But going forward, you can't be, for long-term progress, you can't be a slave to the political football changing every 4 or 8 years with an election cycle, or with the whims of people who don't understand the risk or the difficulties involved or even the expenses. So I'd have to say that now, I think it's like it always is. People confuse enthusiasm for support, and they confuse success with no risk. And but the dynamic has changed with private space, and that competition and that variable creates for an exciting opportunity for the future, which didn't exist before.
I think there's also an interesting point at the moment. We kind of talk about inflection points of what this flight represents, but you know, we're starting to get a point, and we saw it with the shuttle payload specialists, but where you aren't working with test pilots who are used to the risks and understand the inherent risks of the systems. You start to talk about people who maybe assume the thing is safer than it possibly is, a level of commercial space flight. Certainly now we talk about space tourism, and I would be interested to know how much risk has to be waived within the contracts for the flights, how much people are briefed on the risk of it. I mean, you know, as you mentioned, Virgin Galactic had one loss of vehicle event. You are in a world now where you are starting to put more people in vehicles which are by nature still going to be fairly experimental, like commercial flight was in the 30s. And I don't know, it'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, no system is infallible, and when you start seeing commercial providers talking about very high flight rates, you've got to factor into that. They will lose a flight in there. It's just inevitable that will happen. And what will the public appetite be for the system then? What will, we're talking about private companies, what will shareholder appetite be to continue supporting the company when that happens?
All right. Oh, Emeline, did you?
Oh, well, I was just gonna just a short bit saying that I think we're paralleling kind of the birth of the airline industry, which is also the same way in the past, where well-heeled and also risky kind of like flights have happened, and you need to do that for progress. And I think that the same way that, yes, there are big risks that are going to be happening today, and it's going to be a given, but we can't create progress without all of these things being taken in actually happening in place.
Absolutely. I mean, the 737 MAX, if we're gonna compare space flight to air flight, in air flight, everybody's saying the safest in the world, but then you see what happens in the case of the 737 MAX when not everything is thought out, when there are issues that happen through the practical application of everything you've done the testing for, everything you've simulated for, you've done flights, you've done it, but you cannot 100% eliminate risk. I don't care if you're driving your car, flying your plane, or getting on a tourist trip into space. And Chris brings up a great point. We're adding a new layer of complexity to it with private space. And in the case of Virgin, it's a publicly traded company. Their board has a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, the same way that Boeing does and the same way that any airline does. And so it ups the complexity, it ups that multi-dimensional chessboard of decision-making. It'll be fascinating to see how that develops.
Yeah, we're on the verge of not only a democratization of space, but of space risk as well. This is the first, we're being billed as the first commercial space flight, but we're still a government-funded launch of government employees from a government facility to another government facility. It's going to be the next steps as we start seeing normal people taking that decision, and then for the public, it stops being a question of, well, what do I think the government should do with my money and other people's lives? And it becomes a question of, well, what's it worth to me to get on that vehicle? And it's going to, it's going to take part of the question out of the hands of the people who have held it to date, and kind of really make that risk equation a very different conversation. On the risk question, got a question in from Jim Martin, and I'll let anybody that wants this take it. What does risk in spaceflight tell us about risks being taken in response to COVID-19 and climate change today? Anybody want to take that one? That one requires thought. That's
Chris Betty already said it really well, which is the politicians want to see a success. They don't always necessarily want to do the hard work. And I don't think there's much we can add that Chris hasn't already said about spaceflight in general, that also applies to climate change. People want to see a result. They don't necessarily want to get their hands dirty. It's and with a 4-year presidential cycle and a congressional cycle, it's really hard to get anything done. The other part too is public will. Public will push anything to anywhere. And you see that with space funding. You ask the general public about how much of the American annual budget goes to space. They'll say, oh, about 5%, which is, as you know, is way, way, way more, a huge factor than what actually is spent. But if you ask them, is it about the right amount? They'll say, yeah, we're spending about the right amount. So people want results. They don't necessarily want to put a lot of money behind it. They just want it to sort of like dribble along okay. So it's a very, very difficult one. And things change remarkably if voters get out there and change minds. So that's where organizations like the AIAA can really help, because you're out there advocating, you're out there. We're all kind of preaching to the choir today. We're all on this already. We're probably only logging into this because we are already, we've taken the space Kool-Aid already. But what we need to do with books, with some of the stuff David, you do in Huntsville, with all the work we're doing, is to make people realize some of the things we're talking about today. These are important things, and they are life-changing, and particularly things like climate change are going to be affecting all of us, and particularly the next generation, in a huge way. So let's educate. That's all we can do.
Amen. Another question, Emeline, this may be for you, but I'll let anybody that wants to jump in, but I'll let you start. Wonderful for NASA, for the United States, that the money that's being spent on Soyuz seats is now going to be spent on Dragon seats and eventually Starliner seats. Maybe a little less wonderful for Russia. What does the impact of this for Russia's space program look like?
Yeah, I mean, definitely it is going to put a dent in, I think, the Russian budget, because it is, I know that a lot of their budget comes from you know, the seats that they get out of selling for the Soyuz. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, I think for the future, if we are going to have a lot more commercial destinations up there, then those will be potential opportunities for Soyuz flights as well to go up to. One thing to note as well is that in terms of the you know, space tourist flights that have happened over the early 2000s, I think the very last one was around 2009, and that's only because there are no seats to sell from the Soyuz. And that's what I was talking about in terms of the monopoly. And so now I think that if you look at the launch manifests, I think there will be space tourists again happening in the next 2 years via the Soyuz, yeah, just because it has now been freed up.
All right, excellent. Anybody else want on that one, or all right? So a question from Marcy Franker, who's been reading the Outward Odyssey books, for which we thank you and hope you continue to enjoy them. But had the question for Chris specifically, can you discuss your approach to your new book?
Oh, right. Well, I think I've got something in common with a few of the other authors here, that I decided to write the book because it was the book I sort of wanted but couldn't find anywhere else. So, you know, there was lots of books on the X-planes and some really good, fantastic technical histories of the individual programs, but nothing kind of looking over the whole era and saying, you know, trying to understand why things followed each other, what they were trying to achieve, what each successive program opened up, and the next steps they could take. So yeah, I just really started thinking, you know, I'd be interested to read that story. So I kind of put together what I thought would be an interesting narrative based around the programs. But then I was lucky enough to kind of start speaking to some of the people who worked on those programs and some of the veterans out in the Mojave Desert, some of the old guys that worked on the X-15 and the lifting bodies and stuff. And that kind of changed my perspective on the book quite a lot, because suddenly I realized, right, this isn't telling the story of these programs, and it's not telling the story of scientific achievement and progress. It's telling the story of careers, people's lives, the sacrifices they made on the way. And so, yeah, I really wanted to start telling the people's stories and to kind of tell the progress through the people that were there and making these things happen. And, you know, it's very easy when you start writing space history, or you're reading it, and you'll read about some aspect of Apollo or whatever else that didn't quite end up happening, and it gets a footnote in a book. And then you realize, wow, that was probably 8 or 10 years of a team of engineers' lives. And they sweated blood to kind of make that thing happen as best they could. And then it either happened or it didn't. But, you know, you have a responsibility to try and not just look at the things that made it and tell that story, but to look at the people that were working on it and how it impacted on their lives. And yeah, I mean, I did. A lot of the time in my book, it was really trying to counteract a lot of the stuff that was said in the right stuff, which has kind of gone down as a de facto history of what happened out in the high desert, and in pretty much most cases is exactly wrong. Much as I love the right stuff as an entertaining book, it's not a history book, and neither are a lot of the test pilot autobiographies either. So yeah, I think my approach was to try and tell a story that I hadn't heard before.
All right, thank you. I've got two more quick questions. If anybody else in the audience has another question, if you can get them in while we're answering the first one, we'll take them. And otherwise, I'm going to do the last question and we'll be done. So as they used to do on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, fast finger around. But first, given all of this, risk, cost, everything else that we've talked about today, you know, there's a you know, a perpetual conversation about, is this whole space worth it? You know, I imagine I'm probably talking to a biased panel in front of a biased audience, but is it, and why? Should we do what we're doing?
Yes, I think it's worth it, because there are, you know, there are a lot of rewards to be had by continuing to explore in space and to exploit what we can find out there. I also, you know, it's a bit more difficult to quantify, but I think it's good to continue stretching our abilities and to continue going out there. And I think a lot of these arguments I mentioned before about the situation with commercial air travel in the 1930s, and there's a fantastic book called Fate is the Hunter by Ernest Gann about commercial aviation. I think there's a lot of parallels to be drawn between that and the huge risks that the pilots and the passengers faced in that era and where we are now with spaceflight. And a lot of people were saying, well, is commercial aviation really worth it? You know, it gets us somewhere a little bit quicker and allows us to do some different things. But by enduring with it and keeping going, we managed to make something that was safer and opened up a lot of opportunities for us all. So I think the same things will come from space. We may not know what will come from it yet, but I think to take the attitude that that's kind of that costs a bit and that's difficult that's not a reason not to do it.
What does it mean if we don't do it, David, is always my thought. You know, what happens hundreds of millions of years from now when humans are gone and there's some, you know, the evolved squirrels are sitting around having a cup of coffee going, remember those humans that we found the geological record for? The ones who had the technology to stop that enormous asteroid coming in and wiping them out. They just never got round to it because they were they were too busy watching the Kardashians or whatever it was. You know, they just never quite got round to stopping that enormous rock that killed them all. What does it mean if we don't, you know, from a practical point of view like that, but also as a species? Chris said it perfectly. You know, what if we were still going, well, this steam train is fine, this horse is fine, I does what I need all day. We don't know the things we don't know yet, as Chris said perfectly. We need to be doing this for the reasons we don't know yet.
I mean, totally agree. I mean, the future of humanity and its sustainability is actually tied to our outward migration to the solar system. I mean, it's just, we're a finite planet with finite resources. And so that's really where we have to go. It's not an option. So.
Yeah, well, and even from that finite resource perspective, if it just gets down to the crass dollars and cents, as George Lowe would always say in budget negotiations, we don't spend the money in space, we spend it here, right? And it's about developing our industrial infrastructure. It's about developing our technological capability. It's about solving the big problems, whether it is COVID-19, whether it is climate change, whether it is just if we can get from point A to point B faster. And the money that we put into space, we get back 5, 6, 10 times, and not just in the time period we spend it, but in generations later, when that technology, when that innovation gets absorbed into the society and adds on later. I mean, you know, there's that argument, many people make it. I firmly believe that, you know, the fourth wave of the Industrial Revolution, the digitization, would have come anyway, but maybe it came faster and it came in a different mode because of the fundamental investments made during the Cold War in the Apollo program that the Soviets spent money on, and that the formation of other space and technological agencies around the world. We are still direct beneficiaries of that movement, and all that money has a magnifying effect on the betterment of society.
I'm going to jump in real quick. Emeline, who joined us well before 5 o'clock her time, has another meeting that she needs to get to. Thank you so much for joining us today, Emeline. For the rest of everybody, we've got a couple of questions that did come in, but I wanted to say thanks to Emeline before she popped off.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for AIAA for the opportunity, and for UNP, and to the Outward Odyssey authors as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For everybody else, let's see. From Mark Pastana, any guesses on what name the crew will give their spacecraft? Anybody?
Yeah, I was talking to somebody online about this last night, and they were saying, is it going to be named after a person, or is it going to be named after some historical initiative, or will it be kind of, there's a current craze for naming them after some fairly generic noun. So I was kind of thinking, seeing as there's only 2 of them in there, they could call it capacity, and that would kind of fit quite nicely with the current trend.
2 astronauts, call it Gemini?
There's been a movement in this last week with Annie Glenn passing away at 100 years old, unfortunately a victim of COVID-19 related illness. But of course, the widow of the very first American to orbit, this is something that Richard Jurek knows too well about public relations, because there's no good answer to that. I'm sure they have a name picked out a long time earlier, and then in the week before they're doing the final planning, there are people saying, we should name it after Annie Glenn. Now, if you don't, that starts looking bad. If you do, then who knows what other great plan you've thrown out the window. There's probably has to be then some mention of her, but that's where public relations get in there. Hopefully in the middle of all that, we just remember that remarkable woman, but that's definitely a conversation that's happened about crew naming and the crew spacecraft naming in the last week.
All right. Let's see. Another question from Avi. Is there anything specifically about the upcoming DM2 flight you are most excited or concerned about? Excited. I love watching launches like that. that's what I'm most excited about.
For me, it'll be interesting to see the interaction with the automation and the role of the human factors engineering. The Dragon is a very successful vehicle. Now we're adding this variable of the human animal into that equation. How does that go? I'm very much interested in looking at new procedures versus old, such as the load and go and some of the other technical aspects. But more importantly, I'm kind of also looking at the public response. As Francis said about from the public relations response, looking at how this flight is embraced. What is it going to mean? What is it going to mean for private space? What is it going to mean for NASA? What is it going to mean for humanity carrying on further missions? So there's a lot riding on it. It's very exciting. And I, first and foremost, hope for a safe flight. Secondly, hope for full report, and can't wait to hear the post-flight press conference of lessons learned and new capabilities achieved.
I also think it's great to see the Commercial Crew Initiative finally getting to the point of a crewed flight. I mean, I know NASA have constantly been under criticism from various quarters. Well, NASA's always been criticized for anything it tries to do from various quarters. But it was a brave initiative to take on. There's been a lot of things that haven't been smooth along the way with some of the commercial initiatives, but fingers crossed it's going to start bearing fruit now, and it's people will see that there's a vindication to the approach they took, trying to bring various industries, trying to go for a mixed fleet approach. Yeah, I mean, fingers crossed it all goes well, and hopefully people will actually have a bit more faith in NASA's ability to kind of make the right calls on these things.
And Chris, just to build on that, I'm confident we're going to have a safe flight. What I'm more worried about is complacency after a successful flight. We got to be careful we don't let that happen.
So in all seriousness, one of the things I am most excited about, besides it just being a launch, is so my wife worked as a bus tour guide at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center here in Huntsville, doing bus tours of Marshall Space Flight Center. And when she started doing it, she'd have people get on the bus. Oh, are we going to go see where NASA used to be? You know, this was the this was the years kind of immediately following STS-135. There was kind of this sense that the U.S. has gotten out of the space business, and and I've years now of dealing with that. Whatever happened to NASA? And smiled, took it graciously, because I've known that there is going to be a day when we're not only going to see human launches, crew launches from Kennedy Space Center again, we're going to see back to back, and we didn't know the order, now the order is unfolding. We're going to see back to back launch of Dragon, launch of Starliner, launch of Artemis 1 with SLS. This is exciting for what it is for the launch, for the first launch of Crew Dragon. It's exciting as a milestone for commercial spaceflight. To me, it's exciting as the beginning of the American space fleet. I mean, how awesome is it that we now have a fleet of multiple crew space vehicles that we're going to have flying. So, I mean, this is, if you doubted that NASA's still here after STS-135, buckle up, because you're about to see that U.S. spaceflight is still here in a huge way. We haven't seen the end of anything. We're seeing the beginning of a golden age.
Yeah, and if I could just quickly add, David, watching a lot of this stuff online now, and there's a huge interest base in spaceflight at the moment, but unfortunately, people see it as a team sport. They kind of like, that rocket's better than that rocket, or that company's better than that company. And, we should support them all because it's in our best interests. We will get more done if there are 3 or 4 companies capable of putting up commercial spacecraft on a regular basis. And it's not a case of like, oh, well, that company's demonstrated they can do it, so we don't need NASA anymore. It's like, well, you do need NASA because, they actually have the work that needs doing with those spacecraft. Just like the NACA didn't used to build its own aircraft, it used to work with the companies that built the aircraft to make better, safer, more efficient aircraft. So, don't doubt NASA.
So last question then. And it's looking now, I'm seeing that that the weather may make Wednesday actually be Thursday, or there's always that uncertainty. But when Wednesday comes, whatever day Wednesday is, what are your plans?
Glued to the TV.
Yep, I'm looking forward to this being such a wonderful online event. I have friends in Florida who live very, very close to the launch area. I'm going to be able to walk out on their deck and see it, and I'm very, very jealous of them. I have other friends who are a couple of hours drive away who are saying, oh, I might just drive down there and see what I can see, and nope. I am telling them, nope, please do not do that, because they might be risking their own life, and that's their problem, but they would be risking other people's lives, and that's a bigger problem. And then those people might come and meet me, and then that would really be my problem. So I'm looking forward to this being a very safe, everybody sitting at home, enjoying this sort of cyber event.
Yeah, I had no plans to go out anywhere, so I will be glued to some form of media watching it.
Yeah, in addition to that, I mean, the difference between then and now, whether even shuttle or back in the days of Apollo, I had mentioned there were like 44 million TV sets in '69, but newspaper subscriptions were only like around 62 million or something. So that's like 104 million. NASA social media outreach. I mean, if you just look at its top 5 social media channels, and that's just for NASA, not the separate programs, not the astronauts themselves, not SpaceX, not anybody else, reaches about 130 million people. And the beauty of that is the democratization and the diversity of views. We're not just following NASA, but we're following the contractors, we're following private space, we're following the individual astronauts themselves, and we're following different groups like this group and other people's perspectives. So for me, I'm gonna find fascinating is the new version of the global communal experience. Mine was just staring at a picture tube back in the late 60s and early 70s. Now I'm going to actually be engaging with people who are making it happen and hearing firsthand accounts and being a part of that stream of information, which I find is going to be exciting, and do it safely from my own home. The ability to do that is phenomenal. And I'm looking forward to see all the different perspectives from it.
You know, Richard, you touched on something. Finally now, we have 2 astronauts. People know their names. They recognize them. It's kind of neat to see that happen again.
What's amazing is we, the advent of social media, and huge props to NASA for their social media outreach, for Launch America, for all the activities that they're doing. But the exciting thing is too, before you used to have to get that connection through a filter, whether it was through a news filter, through a public affairs filter, you can now follow those astronauts directly, right? And their audience is sticky. It goes with them, whether you're at NASA or you leave NASA and you go to SpaceX, or you leave SpaceX and you go to NASA. It develops a fandom, and it develops an interest level. If you're more technical, you can go to the mission specialists and the program managers and the scientists. If you're more into the media side, you can go to those people. I'd like to toss one other thing out there, that with the advent of private space, Mark Bloom, who followed Apollo, he covered it for Reuters and he covered it for the New York Daily News, said to us when we were writing Marketing the Moon, that one of his regrets was that the newspapers didn't assign business reporters to the beat. They assigned science reporters. Thus, when we shifted the story from exploration and maybe finding life to one of geology on the moon, it bored some of those reporters. They didn't get the payoff. If we had put business reporters on it, they might have seen the investments into the industrial base and where we're going. And you're seeing coverage by the Wall Street Journal, you're seeing coverage by CNBC and others that are talking about, what does this mean to the average person? What does this mean to technology and capabilities? And I use that as just one slice, to your point, on all these different audiences and direct access and people knowing their names. And it is creating an excitement like no other. And it will be fascinating to watch that development go forward.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We've had a great time. We appreciate the Los Angeles, Las Vegas section of the AIAA for hosting us, and Ken for organizing this event. And with that, Ken, I will turn it back over to you. Thank you all very much.